right, everyone, this is a new year and it's a same podcast, but it's a new look on our year. It is 2024. We've got an election coming. We've got a ton of really cool content we're really excited to talk about, whether it be TV or movies or just the world. I mean, again, this is Zeitgeist. So joining me today on my talk about Priscilla and May December is my co-host, Niv and Jordan. How you doing today, man?
Pretty good.
Man, so Oscars are coming up. Do you have any predictions?
No, because I feel like I've been sort of ill-prepared this time. We watched quite a few of them, I will say, but I don't know. I haven't kept as much as you have. It's been a really crazy moment in my life, so it's been a little hard to...
You've been up in the air a lot. That's fair. And you've been keeping up with our podcast materials, which I think alone allows for a perspective in some way, because I think Oppenheimer is sitting pretty close in terms of a lot of the categories.
Absolutely.
Christopher Nolan probably is going to win this year.
I think definitely for Best Director. I really hope that Barbie gets some things too. I remember that I was a little lukewarm about it when we were talking about it in our podcast. I had some issues, but I think that it is something that deserves to win things, especially in comparison to all the other films. Like, it feels in a lot of ways more courageous in terms of like what it's trying to do and what it's trying to say. Whereas Oppenheimer feels like a very classic Best Picture film, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. It feels like a more traditional biopic in many ways, although it definitely has some areas where I think it goes above traditional biopics. But that said, we are actually talking about two pieces that are largely snubbed in the conversation, which does seem to be a factor with our talks, although we have talked about both if Oppenheimer wins this year, both Best Picture award winners throughout the course of our later half of our podcast, which is kind of cool. We talked about Everything Everywhere All at Once.
Which was an easy win, let's be real here.
And we also talked about Oppenheimer, which I expect may win Best Picture as well. But we're going to be talking in a moment about Priscilla, me, and my guest, Samantha Donahue. Before we get into our conversation, I wanted to ask you, Niv, what did you think about Priscilla?
I thought it was good. I like Sofia Coppola's work, especially Lost in Translation is one of my favorite films. It's a really, really good film, and what she does really well is she leans into small character moments, sort of the minutia of life. And I think that's present in a lot of ways in Priscilla, right? Because she hyper-focuses on Priscilla herself, on sort of living in the shadow of Elvis, which I thought was a great structural dramatization of a story. Living in the shadow of someone so much larger than you, but who you're hopelessly in love with and you want to make sort of a future work with. There's a sort of childlike hunger, because she is a child. That is another unifying theme of our episode today. The fact that it does deal with relationships between a child and an adult. It's sickening in so many ways, and both those films show that. But at the same time, you can understand how they fell into those, I don't want to say traps, because that's sort of discounting like the real life love story between Priscilla and Elvis, because I think it does that a little bit better than the real life story that we will talk about with May December, because it is different. But there is sort of a pitfall, because one person has so much more power because they have so much more experience with life than the other person, because they're younger, their mind is narrower, they haven't lived life enough to know what they actually want and what they actually need. I'm about to turn 30 and I've only started realizing what I actually want in my life last year. That's a big change. And I think Sofia Coppola does that really well with Priscilla, but I don't think she pushes it enough. I feel like the movie only starts getting interesting, like truly interesting, when we see the dynamic between Elvis and Priscilla in the second half of the film. because it focuses so much on her wanting to be with Elvis in the first half and working so hard to be with him. And when she gets it, of course, like, it's not what she expected. That's a very classic sort of storytelling thing. But at the same time, you know, there's complexities in that. These are real people. These two people are real people. And in so many ways, this movie, the way it dramatizes their lives, it's like picking snapshots. And those snapshots are not exactly the most attractive or, quite frankly, honest portrayals. Like, they're trying to be honest, right? Because Elvis was abusive towards Priscilla. We know that. But it's really interesting because I read in an article that before Lisa Marie Presley passed away, she sent an email to Sofia Coppola angry at her for portraying her father in a way that wasn't, you know,
wholly positive.
In a way that was kind of damning. And I can understand that because, again, she views him in a different perspective, right? when we look at people, we don't just see them in one perspective. Each person can have a different perspective on one person, right? And I think that's something that's important when we're talking about biopics. I think I said something similar when we covered Spencer, because that in itself was a biopic too. We're taking like a real person and we're reducing them down to a three-dimensional character, right? And at the end of the day, even though we share that in that three-dimensionality, we are far more dimension than a character is.
Right. We live inside something that is more squishy and more sort of, you have to go spiritual to talk about it, but I get what you mean.
Exactly. So I think in that regard, there is a beauty to Priscilla because, again, it focuses on a young woman trying to be with someone she so desperately loves, but constantly feels like she's in his shadow to the point where it forces her to transform into her own being, which is a lovely story, right? Lovely in the sense that the thing she goes through is kind of horrific, feeling like she's forced to grow up immediately because it's not just Elvis, it's everybody around her. They're forcing her to grow up into an adult, even though she's like 16 at that point when she moves to Graceland. And at the end of the day, the opposite is also true, that because it's based on real people, there is a cheapness that emanates from this film.
I also got that from The Iron Claw, which came out last year too, another movie that fell into this general category of prestige happening around December time. And Iron Claw had a similar problem where it had, and I know we're not talking about it today, but it had these really heavy themes, but they were told in a way that felt very segmented. And that is the nature of having somebody who is alive, who's able to critique the work itself, and who's able to give feedback, and sometimes even be a part of the process, which is something that's becoming more and more common, even in the documentary space.
Absolutely. But that's what I mean. It's not a documentary. And even a documentary, it's hard to show something beyond just a couple of perspectives, right? Even if you did like a television show, even if you did The Kardashians, which in its own right is like a documentary about the rich family that is the Kardashians, right? We're viewing them in all sorts of perspectives, but it will never be enough. Doesn't matter how many episodes we cover on one specific subject, we'll never fully be able to cover it. And because it feels so segmented, because there are moments in the film that feel inherently dramatic and we leave on that drama, it's hard to compartmentalize that. There is that famous moment. It's pretty famous because Priscilla refers to it in her book, in her tell-all autobiography.
Yeah, that this film is based on.
Where she started talking to a guy and Elvis, and I think she started sleeping with this guy as well. And Elvis knew. And he said something really awful to her. Something along the lines is, you will never get something better than me. Something around those lines. And it's present in the film. But we don't really see the aftermath of that. We don't see the conversation they probably had of that. Because that's real life. You know, in real life, even though those awful moments happen, like usually you're able to talk about them in various spaces.
Right. You get the quietness, you get the loudness, you get everything in between. You get sort of a whole dialectical of a person's life when you actually get to live every single moment of it. And that's not what this is. This isn't a holistic approach. You have to condense it down.
It's an hour-and-a-half snapshot. And on the other end of that, of course, because it's directly related to real people, it inherently also feels cheap.
And with that, we are going to go to my conversation with Samantha Donahue. Everybody stay tuned and be aware that we are going to be talking about spoilers in this half and in our second half where we talk about May, December. These films are able to be viewed on streaming now. Priscilla is on Max in the States, and May, December is available on Netflix nationwide and worldwide, I think, too. So with that, I will continue on with my conversation. Everybody stay tuned. Okay, everyone, I'm here with Priscilla advocate Samantha Donahue. Hey, Sam, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you, Jordan?
Oh, I'm really great, and I'm really excited to get into this conversation. So I understand that you've seen this movie more than once now, is that right?
Definitely more than once, yeah.
It's a cool movie, and obviously from a really prolific filmmaker, maybe the first Nepo baby that we were really familiar with coming up in the Godfather trilogy, but also has really not only made her own path as a filmmaker, but has, I think, made a distinct path in the world of film. Now, Now, Priscilla is her newest movie. It is, at its core, I think, a coming-of-age story. It uses Kaylee Spaney as the main character in Priscilla. And Kaylee Spaney is, I think, relatively new. I haven't seen her much in anything. It, by and large, follows teenage Priscilla as she marries Elvis Presley. It tells the story of Priscilla, obviously, and then kind of builds a life with him in Graceland, but seems to be sort of away from the public life, is very sort of internal. And in terms of Spaney, she's been actively acting, in fact, since 2016. She's been doing stuff like Devs and Bad Times at El Royale. I think she's going to be in the upcoming Alex Garland movie. So she's been working, but I think relatively quietly. Sam, what is your relationship with Priscilla herself going into the film before we talk about the filmmaker and maybe the design elements in this movie?
So, I grew up, my father was very into rock and roll music, so we listened to a lot of Elvis in my childhood. When I was in middle school, my parents and I, we took a trip to Tennessee and we visited Graceland. I didn't know much about Priscilla until Sofia Coppola announced she'd be making this film, and so as like a diehard Sofia Coppola fan, I immediately delved into a rabbit hole to prepare myself to see this film before it came out. So I read Priscilla's book, Elvis and Me, and that's what this film is based on. And I was just kind of enamored by the way that she wrote about her life with Elvis. So after reading the book, I continued my research by watching lots of interviews of hers and looking at old photos of her and Elvis, learning about their daughter, Lisa Marie Presley, as well. I think she's a very interesting, sensitive woman, and I've gained a lot of respect for her by just like learning more about her. I'm also a very big Lana Del Rey fan, and her early aesthetic was very influenced by Priscilla, like more than anything else. So it was really fun to finally kind of understand all of the references in Lana's work.
And Lana has been in the spotlight. Obviously, she was on stage at the Grammys this weekend with Taylor Swift. But Lana's been a figurehead in our world, I think, for over a decade now. And so can you tell me a little bit about this? Obviously, we're not talking about Lana Del Rey here, but what is the connection between Priscilla and Lana?
So I think Lana, she explores the idea of Americana a lot. That's kind of a huge part of her work. And so I think when she was creating her aesthetic going into Born to Die, she really used Priscilla's iconography to create her own visual aesthetic. She's very obsessed with Elvis. Like, she has a song where she's like, Elvis is my daddy, basically. It's like she's basically saying like Elvis like was her like artistic father almost. So she kind of like and placed herself as Priscilla in this like world that she created. She used a lot of Lolita referencing as well, and like, you know, you could draw some parallels between Lolita and Priscilla, I guess, if you wanted to. Like, just kind of this girl who's obsessed with older men. And she did her hair like Priscilla, she did her nails like Priscilla, her eyeliner, like everything. She really used Priscilla's image to kind of create her own image in the beginning.
Well, and after seeing the movie, I can definitely see a lot of the parallels. I think even the way that Sofia Coppola is shooting the movie does feel very similar to especially the most early Lana Del Rey. For people who maybe weren't teens when Lana was first putting out her videos, she had these like very DIY filmic looking videos, at least starting out, and that's how she kind of gained traction. And I remember seeing them and thinking that she was paradigm shifting, and she definitely was and continues to be throughout her career. I think it's awesome, fascinating. So you mentioned that your dad was into like oldies and stuff. Do you keep any of that? I know you and I are friends in real life, and we don't usually talk about stuff like oldies. Is that something that you ever have a craving for anymore?
I would say I really appreciate like that aspect of my childhood and like being exposed to that music, but it's not really the exact music that I go back and listen to. Like, I don't really go back and listen to Elvis or like Styx or like any of these like rock bands or artists that my dad listened to a lot. But I think because I had that, it made me delve into my own taste as far as like oldies music goes. So I do listen to a lot of older music, just maybe not that exact music I listened to in my childhood with my dad.
I don't often find myself listening to Elvis much either. I mean, I think I have a special relationship with that music, particularly because my grandmother, who I recently lost, was so into Elvis, and I remember she and I would dance around the living room and the late hours of the night just to Elvis music. I mean, she really, really loved Elvis a lot. In fact, married my grandfather because she thought he looked like Elvis. So
oh my God.
I know, cute, right?
Very cute.
But I have a special relationship to it in that way. It's just that, when you look back at it, I think there is a little bit of something to be desired, particularly because looking at Elvis from a 2024 lens, he is, and this is something that was addressed in the movie Elvis a couple of years ago, a uniquely white figure in a predominantly black space. And so I think that is one of the things that we continue to see as maybe problematic. And obviously the movie Priscilla doesn't even touch that and goes into a very different direction, but still shows how Elvis may or may not be problematic. But specifically, before we get into that minutia, I wanted to talk a little bit more big picture. And obviously, the movie Priscilla deals with Priscilla, and Priscilla's character arc is largely defined by her relationship with Elvis. And I was having trouble with the movie a little bit because that relationship is so definitive, and it often feels a little small, especially compared to Sofia Coppola's other work, which manages to be intimate, but still have a little bit of broadness. There are some things that aren't necessarily shown. There's a little bit of, I would say, ambiguity. And while I think this movie has some of that ambiguity, it's also very explicitly period piece. And obviously there is a late shift in her individual story, but I think it might just be a little bit a case of too little too late. So tell me, Sam, what would be your first read on the film Priscilla? What was your initial response, and did it change at all with additional viewings?
I still think it's just so crazy that her parents let her go and live with Elvis as a teenager. You see their reluctance and them grappling with the fact that if they don't let her do that, she might just run away or hate them forever. But it's still just wild to me, even though it was a different time, it still was very taboo. So it really brings it to a different level when you see it played out in film. Like, I read the book, but something about just seeing it on the screen in front of me, it just made it feel really intense, like that whole concept.
The way that Spaney looks so diminutive in comparison to the Elvis character is really kind of jarring.
It is.
Even though Spaney is 25 years old, so she's not as young as maybe some other actresses who play that age gap in previous Sofia Coppola films. Still, she is really sort of small and looks young throughout the movie. I watched a video by someone who I know you and I really enjoy the work of, Broey Deschanel.
Love her.
Did a video essay about Priscilla, and she talks about the dichotomy of transcendence versus immanence, and specifically the way in which Priscilla is sort of locked up. So talk to me about that. Did you feel like on rewatches you were able to sit more comfortably in this pent-up setting? Where exactly do you live in that regard? I'm going to definitely touch on this a little bit later, but there's the film Marie Antoinette, which this shares some common DNA with. But whereas that feels very expansive, you see the whole of Graceland in Priscilla, and it starts to feel really small.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Some great context that I learned previous or post watching the film was that they really struggled to secure proper funding for the film. And so I really think that if they had gotten more funding for the film, we might have gotten to see more of Priscilla gaining her independence, which did happen outside of her relationship with Elvis. In her book, Elvis and Me, there's a lot of things that she talks about, even an affair that she had that kind of started to garner a little bit of feelings of independence outside of that relationship with Elvis. And just, she became very passionate about dancing and karate and just doing her own thing and starting to play around with her style and her hair, since Elvis had been really controlling about her image. And so we just don't get to see a lot of that in the film, but I think that if they'd gotten more funding, we might have been able to actually see her step outside of Graceland more. I mean, it was said that they only had a few days to really shoot in Los Angeles. And Sofia even had to use clips from an old Cartier commercial that she directed in 2018 to show Priscilla driving in her car in LA. So I think that really added to that kind of rushed feeling at the end of her driving off in that car. I think just, the film did feel really small. It was just a lot of moments of her just kind of being stuck in the house. But I do think that really matches up to what she described in her book, Elvis and Me. Really was she was just kind of kept there to be ready for Elvis at any moment that he needed her.
And it's interesting, I think the most interesting parts of the movie is watching her transition into becoming this kept woman. And at the beginning of the story, you get a little bit more of her world, I think. Well, there's, of course, the parents of Priscilla, who are played by Ari Cohen, and Dagmara Dumchik, who I adore. I've seen, I think, almost everything Dagmara Dumchik has done in the past year. She was in Bottoms. Did you see Bottoms?
I did. Who was she in Bottoms? I can't think of it.
I think she was someone's mother. She was having an affair, is what I recall. Spoilers for Bottoms, I guess.
Oh, yes.
She's been in a lot of things. She was in this really sort of, which I'm going to probably talk about later with Niv. We've only got so much time, you and me, Sam. She was in this awful movie called Miller's Girl this month. Really not very good. But she was in it, and she does a wonderful job playing sort of this very particular type. Anyway, great actress, was in the show Succession. I've been a big fan of hers for a very long time and really love to see her work, even in these sort of bit roles. And regardless, you have also Luke Humphrey playing the friend of Elvis. I think the scene with him in the diner early on with Priscilla is one of the more interesting moments, in that he and she sort of have this back and forth, and you get to see her align herself with her own autonomy, which is something that she doesn't get throughout the entire film.
Totally.
So then we move into the actual moment of Elvis. Now, of course, I have not yet said that we have another teen heartthrob playing Elvis. This is the second time in a couple of years, in the form of Jacob Elordi. Have you seen Euphoria, Sam? Have we talked about Euphoria?
I don't think we've really talked about Euphoria. I don't even know if I realized that you were a Euphoria viewer.
Oh my God. I am. I'm kind of a Euphoria stan. I actually watched all of The Idol too. I'm kind of embarrassingly...
Oh, me too.
Oh my God. So,
no, me too.
I mean, I love, okay, so the thing about The Idol is that it has some of the best actors working right now, and some of the most interesting people in the business, and some of the best singers, singing songs. It's just a really strange contraption. So, in regard to infantilization, speaking of The Idol and Elvis's POV, there is this sense of conflict in the story between Priscilla's parents and Elvis. How do you feel like the story's access to Priscilla's parents impacts the later events from the film? Do you feel like this achieves something from a mechanical story perspective? Do you think that there's a way that the parents' relationship to Priscilla justifies or maybe antagonizes Elvis's point of view? Because there are both sides, right? There's the side where Elvis is really in Priscilla's life, and there's also the side where Priscilla's parents sort of worry about Elvis taking advantage of Priscilla, and then eventually they let her go.
Right. I think they could have done a lot more with this in the film, because in the book, I mean, she just talks about her parents so much more. I feel like in the film, they're kind of just stuck in the beginning of the film, and then it's just, you never see them, hear of them again. But in the book, she talks about she would go on trips to Vegas with him, and, she'd have to call her parents every so many days, or just didn't really in the film tie them back in at any point. So I think you just see them in the beginning, they struggle a little bit with the idea, and then they just accept it, and then she goes, and then you just never see them again. So I think it does just kind of create this narrative of oh, well, they were a little thrown off by this at first, but, I guess they've accepted it and everything is okay. Where in the book, you see her loop back to this constant struggle with her parents and their feelings about her relationship with Elvis. I mean, I think her stepfather definitely respected Elvis more because he had been in the military himself. And so it was something that maybe kind of made him feel better, just the way he was as a person. But in her book, she does talk about those struggles more. So I wish we'd seen that more throughout the film.
I agree, especially because they are effectively the moral voice in a world that feels very different from our own. But Sam, the real reason I wanted to bring you in here is because I feel like you have such a particular design sensibility. I've seen the inside of your apartment. It's beautifully curated. And I think similarly, Sofia Coppola has, and she talks about this, in fact, in the article that you referenced earlier, the way in which she like creates a design space when she's making a new film, and she's pulling all of these aspects of the film in real time and creating a world in her own design environment and then creating it on a soundstage or in a physical location. So obviously the film in terms of its form is characterized by subtlety, and I think for Coppola, the form is the function. So we're not really as interested. She keeps her dialogue very pared down. She works to keep the image. And I mean, she's a filmmaker. She understands film and she understands image. And I think she understands that sometimes as well or better than her father. Godfather fans, come at me. But then you have the design as a key feature. So obviously the design allows for the character to change. And the subtle changes under Elvis's influence is the character arc of the film. It's, I don't think, something that you can peel apart and make into two different things. For Coppola, it is one and the same. Obviously, there's the confinement in the bedroom. There's this melancholic, but still aesthetically pleasing. I mean, I would say like Lana Del Rey core could be very easily applied here. How do aesthetics play a role in Sofia's past work?
Yeah, so I mean, Sofia's background is in fine arts, painting and photography, and that means that she really does think in images. You know, like you said, her films are notoriously short on dialogue, and instead they convey information and emotions through images instead of words. So to kind of learn about the characters and their internal changes, we rely on visual cues like their facial expressions and their clothing to learn more about them than we do from the words that are coming out of their mouth. I mean, critics love to dismiss Sofia's work with being overly preoccupied with surface, but like you said, sensibility. I love that word for her. It's her sensibility is everything. Implication that a unique visual style lacks meaning because it's pretty speaks towards, I think, the manner in which people just don't necessarily have the internal understanding to, I guess, understand her work. Her concern for style can make her seem superficial, but I think when you watch Sofia's films, you can feel her inherent sensitivity and just the intense care that she gives to her subjects and the aesthetic choices that come along with that. And in her film, style is substance. It just is. I think that really shines through in her work. And Sofia's a Taurus. And if you like astrology, then you know that Tauruses are masters of the senses. I mean, it's ruled by Venus. And you can really see that in her work in the sense that her soundtrack, the costumes, the food, it's also beautifully curated. But it's not this ingenuine thing where she's like meticulously thought about it. It's just this inherent part of her that just, I don't know, just shines through.
So this particular design sensibility, I mean, she's had quite the career, right? She's done work that we don't often talk about in stuff like The Beguiled or Somewhere, Bling Ring, On the Rocks on Apple TV. But there are also some serious classics. Lost in Translation and The Virgin Suicides, for me, are two of the most intensely beautiful films I've ever seen in my life. And they have really shaped me as both an artist and as a person living in this world. Is there something that stands out in her filmography that you feel like has that design sensibility that she brings into Priscilla?
I mean, I think, yeah, Marie Antoinette, I think those two films just have so many parallels. But, you know, I agree about Lost in Translation and Virgin Suicides. I think those two movies and Marie Antoinette are always going to be her three strongest films, in my opinion.
I will say it's nice to see that the Elvis stuff is pulled back in terms of the actual soundtrack. Now, when it comes to a Elvis movie, you expect an Elvis soundtrack, but I think the way that we are deconstructing Elvis as a myth is it's so important not to codify the myth into the film as much as possible, because we do see a lot of the love that Priscilla has for Elvis through the storytelling. Obviously, through especially this like really flowery, really soft approach. It's very easy to feel like we are mythologizing Elvis further. Now, you could expect that Priscilla's life is glamorous and free, but obviously the film portrays her existence as constrained and confined, and scene, there's a notable scene where Elvis is giving Priscilla a makeover, and it symbolizes his control and claim over her. This is what I'm talking about. The aesthetics are, in fact, the plot. And the plot, I think, also, especially in Priscilla, feels like a tapestry. I would say that is absolutely the case in Lost in Translation. And it's a sequence of events. It's about, and I look at certain scenes in Lost in Translation, which I've seen dozens of times. The scene in a karaoke bar between the two main characters is so wonderful, and it has a beginning and middle and end, and so it feels like it's a sequence. So talking about Elvis and Elvis's portrayal, Jacob Elordi, as I mentioned, has been in Euphoria. He was just in Saltburn. He's got a bit part in this new movie, The Sweet East, which is one of my favorite films I've seen in a very long time. And this interpretation of Elvis, I think, can be a little bit contentious, especially because there was just a film that came out that made a whole lot of money by Baz Luhrmann of the Romeo and Juliet movie, and he's made a lot of other films, titles that escape me right now. But his film, I think, Luhrmann specifically, maintains Elvis's mystique.
I did not particularly love that film. I mean, I know that Baz Luhrmann's style always employs like a sense of the dramatic, and I think you're right in the sense that you see him this mystique. And I just think that Priscilla really brought this naturalness and this reality to the caricature of Elvis that I just didn't see happen in Elvis by Baz Luhrmann. I think Jacob Elordi just did a really good job of bringing a more naturalness to this role of Elvis than Austin Butler did. Priscilla's role in that film just felt really small and one-dimensional to me. And I think that Sofia did a great job in portraying their story with a sensitivity that captured all of the different dynamics of their relationship, but also the different inner parts of both Elvis and Priscilla. We see the parts of Elvis that are childlike, as well as his controlling side and his temper. And I just don't think we get to see that in Elvis in the same way.
I'll give Luhrmann some credit because I do like his style.
I do too, yeah.
I thought that Elvis was good up to a point. It's just that the matter of, and it's very aesthetically focused, but it's also really broad, and I think the biggest flaw that it has is by letting Elvis off the hook by using the Colonel as a consistent foil. So the Colonel is the villain, and it's played by Tom Hanks in maybe the most ridiculous role he's ever played, with this very odd-sounding Southern accent. And it addresses Elvis's complex persona in the end, but it shows him as an icon. And I think in Priscilla, it shows him as a domestic figure. It shows him as a man.
Yeah, you see him in his home as a man. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, there's a quote that Priscilla had said about Elvis. It was he became my father, husband, and nearly God. She talks a lot about their dynamic in the book. She would be the stronger one, mother taking care of him like a baby, cutting his steak up for him at dinner, and him completely dependent on her. And the next day he'd be her father, teaching her how to dress, how to wear her hair, how to act, how to live in all senses of the way, teaching her to become a woman, become an adult. And I just think these are the dynamics that we get to see portrayed in Priscilla because it is focused on the domesticity and their relationship. Yeah, you just don't get to see much of Priscilla at all in Elvis.
So when we talk about Priscilla's perspective, what I've seen in this film is that he occasionally appears a little one-dimensional. So here's where I think I struggled to fully connect with the film, because I think it really captures Priscilla's full arc, but Elvis is obviously more difficult to portray perfectly. And I think especially in the way in which we only see a little hairs of his toxic behavior. So that is something where I think I struggled a little bit to connect. And it's, I think, not a perfect movie for that reason. I mean, I've loved a lot of Sofia Coppola's work in the past, but seeing the ways in which Priscilla's drawn to his darker aspect is really revelatory. But I think the subtlety is almost too subtle at times. And you get these huge arcs, like the scene where Elvis throws a chair at her, right? And there's really a moment where we get that sense that he is not a great guy. But if you look at the Luhrmann film, you get a lot more of those moments. And I think it's because Luhrmann is really interested in this sort of melodrama. And Obviously, Lerman, I think, takes it too far in some places. But I think Coppola could also stand to be a little bit more melodramatic. I mean, of course, the problem is that's sort of like oil and water, because Coppola is never, I mean, even in something like The Virgin Suicides, which is chronicling this really dramatic event, she doesn't chronicle it with a lot of flair. She is really sort of small and detail-oriented. And I'm curious, where do you feel like her POV sometimes loses anything, especially in her later career where she's sort of tackling stuff like a biopic, which can be really difficult to nail, especially if you are so focused on a particular thing? I mean, I think Lerman is even more at fault here, obviously, but specifically because we're talking about Coppola.
Well, I mean, I think a big thing to bring in is that Priscilla herself was, wow, she was a producer on the film, and so she was there. And so I think, Priscilla really tries to protect the story of their relationship, and she still talks about him like he was the love of her life, and I was a young girl, but I was much older in spirit. I think there's just a lot that she still just wants to keep to herself and to keep private and to protect. Since this movie was based off of her book, we really only get to see what Priscilla will allow us to see, but also what she has even accepted in herself at her older age. And also her daughter, Lisa Marie Presley, before she passed away tragically, I believe it was like maybe a year and a half ago, she had a lot of issues with film Priscilla and how it was portraying Elvis, her father. And so I think she had been, I had read some stuff about her getting into arguments with Sofia and her mother over this. And so I think there was only a certain place that they would go to for those kind of familial reasons.
Well, and it's interesting because there is some obvious taboo in the film itself and kind of baked into the history. And it's a taboo that Coppola seems kind of familiar with. Obviously, Lost in Translation is one of my favorite films. And Bob in Lost in Translation is significantly older than Charlotte, the character played by Scarlett Johansson, who was actually only 17 during filming. So she's playing older. And it's really jarring to watch that film in that context. What do you feel like her take is? I mean, it's a unique take on the taboo topic, and why do you think she's drawn to this narrative?
Yeah, I mean, and just like my research, just watching interviews of Sofia talking about why she made this movie, she was kind of attracted to this world that's glamorous and wild, but how Priscilla is still going through these moments that just teenage girls go through just in this setting that's larger than life with this man that's larger than life. And I do think that Sofia was the person to make this film. She has been named the master of the gilded cage archetype in film due to her own life experience growing up as Francis Ford Coppola's daughter. And I think her films tell the stories of women who have maybe financial privilege or power even, but maybe living in emotional poverty and feeling deep loneliness. And like at the end of the day, I just think Sofia has this inherent sensitivity that really does shine through in her films. I also think there's just this sense of comfort that Priscilla might have felt with Sofia because they hadn't met in person until they had started working on this film. But there is this weird fun fact connection that Priscilla's daughter, Lisa Marie Presley, her daughter with Elvis, had been married to Nicolas Cage for a while, who was Sofia Coppola's cousin. So I don't know if that maybe just that small connection just made Priscilla feel a little more comfortable with Sofia, but I think Sofia's sensitivity made her the right person to make film.
You're not the first person to draw that conclusion. It is widely believed that that may in fact be the case. Now, let's focus again on the design sensibilities of Coppola. I'm just curious, what is the read that you got? What insight were you able to gather about Graceland and Coppola?
You can draw a lot of parallels between the film Marie Antoinette and Priscilla, and why Sofia was kind of attracted to telling both of those stories. Just kind of these larger than life settings, almost ridiculous at times.
I loved Marie Antoinette. I thought it was really interesting, the differences, but also the similarity. Because obviously there is kind of a similar way that she's approaching the material. She's keeping her unique point of view, but she's also adding in some other stuff. And I really thought Marie Antoinette was a rich narrative. Now, there are going to be those, and there were those at the time, who chalked it off as fluff, and especially because it stands out with this really anachronistic jukebox soundtrack. I thought it was not only groundbreaking and boasts a really bold costume design, I think that all of that adds depth to the character, and it really creates an interesting point of view where it pulls this time period that we're all very familiar with, the 80s and obviously the New Romantics, and bashes it against the French Revolution, where excess was so prominent. And similarly, the Reagan administration was very, very excess oriented. So talking about Priscilla and the way that this film stands out, I think it's constrained by its historical accuracy a little bit. And I think that while the setting of Versailles, obviously, as I mentioned, allows you to kind of imagine what's outside the world, Priscilla so closely replicates Graceland that it, I think, limits some of Coppola's artistic license. And that was my other main critique for this film. So Priscilla's story is obviously closer to modern times. Have you ever considered, I'm going to just post a theory out here, that the way in which we view films before we had an opportunity to take a photo feels different than post-photograph, because we have photos of Elvis, we have photos of Priscilla, we have photos of Graceland, we have archive material that we have to replicate.
Yeah, I mean, I think you definitely see that in Priscilla. She definitely really used photos of Elvis and Priscilla to create the film and to kind of recreate iconic, moments or outfits of them together. I do think that that could have been limiting in the way that this film looks. And I do think it did kind of miss the mark on the sense that there is like a bit of a gaudiness about the 50s. And I think sometimes aesthetically this film made things a little more smooth and just less gaudy than things looked in the 50s and the 60s.
That's a fair point. And I think the wonderful thing about Coppola is that she can find a way to take things that are gaudy and anachronistic, like in the movie Marie Antoinette, which I would also love to hear your sort of broad takes on, with something that is much more historically accurate. So she's able to stretch the material a little bit. So I think that taking this stuff, this kitschiness, this sort of plasticky new America would have been a wonderful opportunity.
Yeah. Even just like when you see them on their wedding day, there's something about them on their wedding day. If you look at that image in Priscilla versus like the image in real life, you can just see the difference really is this like gaudiness of like these big red flowers and just the makeup and everything on their wedding day and the cake. Like there's something about Priscilla, the film, that just really smoothed it, glossed it over. It's very beautiful, but I really do think that gaudiness could have added something.
Sam, I want to thank you so much for coming on today. To close things off, tell me what you think about something like Marie Antoinette, and specifically, what is the thing that the straight white men that are so beloved in Hollywood should learn from someone like Sofia Coppola, who has such an intuitive sense of design?
There's something about a period piece that normally you watch it and it's just so concerned with historical accuracy and the music matching up to that. And it can be dull sometimes. Like there's just not this fun about it. And, you could argue that that time wasn't very fun, probably in a lot of ways. But I love that Sofia decided to make Marie Antoinette just so fun and frivolous and over the top, and just added her own spin with the use of that new romantic soundtrack. And, in the scene where they're playing I Want Candy and they are showing all the different shoes that Marie Antoinette is trying on, there's this shot where there's a pair of high-top Converse that you see, and people were outraged over that just still image of seeing a pair of Converse in there. And the inaccuracy, but I think that's what made this film so iconic. She really showed that Marie Antoinette was a teenage girl, and she was placed in this crazy setting. She was given power at such a young age, and she really was just a teenage girl, kind of a fish out of water in this new country. And a teenage girl is going to act like a teenage girl. She's going to want to shop and spend the money that she has as this royal person in power and eat cake and cute little macaroons and just be a girl. And I think that that is an FU to white men. It's for the girls.
Is it possible for a kind of boring male filmmaker to do something like Sofia Coppola?
To do what she did with Marie Antoinette specifically?
Or any of her films. I mean, she has a very particular view.
I sure haven't ever seen a male filmmaker create what Sofia Coppola has created in her films. I mean, I'm not going to say that it has to be a woman to do it, but I haven't seen anything that rivals her sense of style or ability to create moods or, I don't know, just like sensitively show the stories of women.
What's up? Enjoying Zeitgeist? Share the vibe with two friends who appreciate great tunes and reviews as much as you do. You're tuning in through a favorite platform, and we love that you're here. But guess what? There's much more to explore. You can dive right in at Zeitgeist's home on Mixcloud for an unbeatable selection of the coolest new tunes accompanying every episode. That's our exclusive treat just for you. With Spotify's music and talk feature bowing out, Mixcloud is now the sole spot to appreciate our podcast in its richest form, completely ad-free. So until next time, keep your podcast adventurous and your spirits high. Your next audio escape awaits on Mixcloud. Okay, and we're back, and I'm once again joined by my co-host, Mr. Niv Elbaz, in the studio. How you doing today, buddy?
Pretty good.
Awesome. So we obviously are now going to be talking about May December, the other section of our quasi-Oscars talk. It's kind of interesting, Niv. For a couple years in a row, we've talked about movies that I've really thought were interesting, but also didn't do very well at the Oscars. I remember once we had a conversation about Lost Daughter and Spencer. Neither one of them really performed all that well. Do you think that's the Zeitgeist Curse? Or is it just because the movies that are the ones we like to podcast about are the ones that the Oscars are less interested in?
Well, there's this whole idea of the Oscar film, right? Yeah. What constitutes an Oscar film? And some films feel like they're just made to go to the Oscars. But then there are other films that are just good films that don't go to the Oscars. Just because a film is not at the Oscars doesn't mean it isn't good. It just means it doesn't fit the Oscar judging audience or whatever.
Yeah, well, and sometimes the Oscar movies are also a little simple. A lot of the stuff that does well occasionally is so refined and so simple, and not necessarily bad in every way, but I think of like Danny Boyle's Slumdog Millionaire is one of my favorites from the Oscars in the past couple of years, but it's also not a deeply complex movie. It just feels important. And it also has a great actor in Dev Patel.
I absolutely agree. And we've had these similar conversations in the past where we look at our zeitgeist and the Oscars sometimes just doesn't represent our zeitgeist. And sometimes it does. You know, I remember there was that really famous Oscars where it was all white.
Wait, I also don't remember the year of when that was. We don't remember off the top of our heads, but it was recent. It was within the past decade.
Yeah, exactly. And I think like the next year, it was that year that Chris Rock hosted and he poked fun at it relentlessly. And again, I think one of the responses to that was Green Book winning. Yeah. You know, that was the big conversation piece that Green Book won. It was a movie about African Americans and their relationship to America during like a time where they were especially disenfranchised. Like we've talked about this as well. Minorities in the United States are still quite disenfranchised, but it feels like the Oscars catch up with the zeitgeist as opposed to have their finger on the pulse of the zeitgeist. But, you know, there have been times where they've done like a pretty good job. There was a year where La La Land and Moonlight went head to head, and I was so sure La La Land was going to win because it played more to the Oscars sensibility, and I was so pleasantly and happily surprised when Moonlight won.
Because Moonlight was a more interesting film, even though it's not necessarily a film that I think I grab onto nearly as much. I mean, it's very quiet, and Barry Jenkins kind of does that. He makes these very quiet movies, and whereas La La Land was very rambunctious, and I mean, that's the thing between him and Damien Chazelle, who Damien Chazelle followed that up with Babylon, which is rambunctious times 10. Moving from that to May December, I mean, May December is a really interesting piece because it is directed by Tom Haynes. He's one of those people that the Oscars likes, but they don't love him. You know what I mean? Like, Carol did okay at the Oscars. I don't remember what exactly it won. I actually have it up here. I have to be my own research team. So let me see if I have an accolade list on Carol. Yeah, so it did okay. It actually did get a lot of nominations, but it didn't win anything at the Oscars. Now, it did win in other less, maybe, like, well-known award ceremonies, but I think that shows that Haynes is one of those people that lives kind of on the fringes of it, and he's never quite broken in. And Carol, I found, was fine. It was definitely a period piece, and it was well acted, but it isn't one that I tend to go back and visit. And I did watch May December twice for this conversation, but I also think it's similarly one of those weird things. Now, Haynes, I believe, also directed a movie that is like similarly strange called I'm Not There. So I think I'm Not There is a good way to approach something like May December because May December is so idiosyncratic, and I'm Not There is like quirky to the max. So it's a Bob Dylan biopic, but it has a bunch of actors playing Bob Dylan. So you get these vignettes of various actors all playing a different version, a fictionalized different version of Bob Dylan. As you can see, that translates pretty closely to May December, but I think the main difference is that May December is less stylized. It's a little bit more focused. I mean, it is still stylized in a way, but it's more focused, and is more focused on a certain subject. And of course, that subject is Gracie, who is a interesting character to pursue, but a worthwhile subject nonetheless. So the thesis of this movie is that you have Elizabeth, who's a stranger, and she comes to town to interview Gracie about her past. And then Elizabeth gradually throughout the movie starts to insert her way into Gracie's life. So that is the sort of basis. You've got Gracie, who lives in this little stead, and then you have Elizabeth, who is the city girl, and she's coming in. So I've heard some people, including somebody I've referenced closely throughout this, who has both reviewed Priscilla and May December on her YouTube channel, Broy Deschanel. She's a video essayist, and she has two very interesting reviews on this particular subject, and I'll reference her a little bit later as well in our conversation. But I think her emphasis on this as a melodrama is a worthwhile thing because it is very simple story, and it doesn't really go outside of the town that it sets itself in. And I think that's an asset to it in a way, and I think it also maybe held me back a little bit.
Well, I think the key word here is mellow, right? It feels very, very mellow. I was watching it with my younger sister when we were supposed to watch these films, and she was bored out of her mind because the movie is quite slow, and it very much focuses on the quiet moments and the subtext between the characters. And I actually compared it a lot to a play. There was a lot of moments where these silences like practically screamed at you, and you needed to pay attention. I think a lot of the dramatic moments of the movie are lost unless you're really paying attention because they're very nuanced. They're excruciating, but in a very subtle way, because so much is hidden underneath the surface in this film. So much of the conflict, so much of the abuse. And it's because on the surface, they live in this perfect little life in their little stead, as you just said. But as, previous storytelling structures have shown, when a stranger comes to town, that, goes upside down.
Yeah, nothing good comes of it. But the nature of it is that, without spoiling anything, the things that happen feel very internal. You know what I mean? It's not like Elizabeth is coming to town and she's going to turn everything upside down by the time she leaves. She's not destroying anything about the town itself. She's just coming in and she's turning over stones, I guess to say. She's really just bringing stuff to life. She's tilling the soil. But I think tilling the soil is a good metaphor. She's not kicking the stones down to the curb. You know what I mean? It's not like in something like Killers of the Flower Moon is about the book itself. The movie is a little bit different. The movie, which is another thing that's being nominated this year at the Oscars, and the book both eventually cover this crime. And there are people who come into town. There are strangers who eventually do show up. In the book, it happens immediately. In the movie, it happens a little bit later. But there are strangers who eventually come into town and they start to actually make significant changes. Elizabeth doesn't do that, but it's also relative to the nature of the story. You mentioned mellow.
Yeah, and I think think the reason why it's like that is because she has a purpose. That's the whole point of a stranger coming to town. They're there with a specific purpose, and something drew them to this new environment, and this new environment needs to be changed. Elizabeth, played by Natalie Portman, comes to town to study Gracie, played by Julianne Moore, in order to basically play a character based on her. They're making like a movie about the life story of Julianne Moore's Gracie.
Yeah, of Gracie, and a specific time frame of her life too. The basic story is basically that, well, it's basically that it parallels real events and fiction. So it's actually a true story of a woman who marries a middle schooler. That actually happened in real life, and her name is Mary Kay Letourneau. And I think the story is deeply explored and really gets underneath the character of Gracie herself, or of Mary Kay Letourneau. And the point of view character is, in fact, the stranger. This is a classic storytelling trope. So the stranger coming to town gets to view everything with fresh eyes, and so do we as the viewers. And of course, Natalie Portman is investigating in her small way. And so it allows for the audience to view these subjects, but it also gives Haynes the time, and the screenwriter the time, to critically analyze these societal issues. So May December ends up turning real life into something that it's a transformation. It takes this idea and it investigates it, it criticizes it, it makes it a point of view, and then it comes out the other side something a little bit different, and it feels very Haynes. Actually, I agree with you. It definitely feels like a play. It has these dramatic movements, and these dramatic movements are notable in the second half, but they're also very subtle, and it does feel like your brain is being exercised more than your heart.
It feels almost exhausting to watch, not just because of the subject matter, but because it forces you to pay attention to the subtleties present in the storytelling. And I think that's what makes it feel so true in some ways, because it deals with the concept of abuse. And abuse, as we've talked about both in, I think, Spencer in particular. I'm glad you shouted that episode back.
Well, then that's a very obvious comparison point to both of these movies.
Yeah, but abuse is subtle. Real abuse, real, visceral, painful abuse is subtle. It's almost passive. But it's passive with terrible intention. That's how I would describe it. And I think, in particular with this movie, the person who's really in control, because a lot of people in this movie think they are in control, but the person who's truly in control of everything is the subtlest and most intentional person of them all. And that's what makes them dangerous.
Well, but what's interesting is when you say that, that could be Gracie or Elizabeth.
Correct.
That's the tension of the movie. And I think that's the thing that people like about the movie, is that both of these characters could be considered insidious. I'm actually curious, Niv. You have a stance. You have a pretty hardline stance that I bumped up against throughout time. And I am coming up short today. The protagonist is always one person, you say.
Always.
So Gracie and Elizabeth both have an argument for protagonism, but you know in your heart that there is only one. Who is it?
There's only one. It is Elizabeth, Natalie Portman's character. And the reason she is the protagonist is because she's the one that's changing the most, right? That's what a protagonist goes through. They go through change. They go through a transformation. And her transformation is that she thinks she's the one in control. She comes into this town. She is like a predator looking for prey. She comes there with intention. She comes there to study her subject, which is Gracie, so she could replicate her in a role. That is her goal, and she's willing to do anything to make that the most believable thing possible. As an actress, that's what she wants. She wants to sell that trauma in award-winning sort of way for her artistry or whatever she tells herself. But as the movie goes on, the more she's in touch with the idea of like, wow, I'm really in control here. Everybody here in this little town is around my little finger. She truly believes that. But it takes the end. We're not going to spoil anything, but it's sort of like the tables are turned on her. And then it's revealed like who is truly like the protagonist here versus who's the antagonist here. An antagonist is not just the oppositional force to the protagonist. They actually represent the oppositional force towards the entire story. And when you think about it that way, who is the character that has complete control over the environment, over their surroundings? It's not the person who came in. It's the person who's lived there forever and truly established the structure they have of control over everyone around them. And it's not Elizabeth, it's Gracie. And again, if a protagonist represents change, Elizabeth represents that change. Gracie represents that stagnancy, that control.
So you're highlighting something about Gracie's internal state that I'd like to get into a little bit, which is that her place in this world is a house of cards. Now, of course, she does eventually make moves to tighten the foundation, but throughout the film, she has this anxiety about Elizabeth, and her anxiety is largely proven correctly. Obviously, there wouldn't be drama otherwise, but her entire existence is in denial. And something that people find really interesting, and I've heard a lot of critics, obviously, we're the last people to come in and review this, so I was able to get a lot of information from other people, specifically talking about the hot dog scene in the opening. So for those who haven't seen it, go watch it. It is on Netflix now. The story begins with a hot dog being like laid on the grill. Gracie walks into the kitchen in a tizzy. She's worried about everything. She's worried about how much her husband is drinking. She's worried about all of this stuff, and she opens the door and she's freaked out, and there's this sound cue that plays, this dramatic sound cue. She says, "I don't think we have enough hot dogs." And then it cuts to a grill full of hot dogs, an absurd amount of hot dogs. And that proves the point. That starts the drama off with a single thing. What do we know about the character immediately? This is really good storytelling. It is very nuanced. It is very subtle. I don't know if it's completely to my taste, to be honest, but I think it is well done in the sense that she immediately has one character trait that we have to remember, which is that she is in denial with the basic facts of reality. And that is how she is able to marry a child. So when confronted, then Gracie reacts in a very small way. She retreats and she forces the other person to come forward. She evokes pity rather than insight. And her life is then confined into this very specific space. It's very strange too, because the community still supports her. She has this meaningless job that is baking pineapple upside down cakes, and she trims flowers sometimes, but it seems like she has just kind of like a fake life. What's that movie? The Stepford Wives. They like don't have real jobs. Or Don't Worry Darling is another example of like women who don't have real jobs and they just sort of like go about their day in this utopia. Busy work, ultimately. It's just work for no sake at all. And then her husband, in contrast, who I'll talk about a little bit later, he views her more as a duty than a partner, and they end up living in this fragile, ignored reality. And so the things that Gracie has been built for her, by her, and that delicate balance is then broken eventually, and she has to clean up the pieces, and that's the drama of the movie. So behind the scenes of this movie, you have Sammy Birch, is a name I haven't said yet. So Sammy Birch is the writer of May December, and she's actually, I think this is her first produced feature. She previously honed her skills on short films, and do you know what her next movie, her next project is, Niv?
I feel like it's a super commercial film.
It is a super commercial film, but it's also a commercial film that will never see the light of day. It's called Acme versus Coyote, or Coyote versus Acme.
Rest in peace.
So poor Sammy Birch has had such a solid momentum, and I believe she's also in, I think that her one take in the Oscar race is for Best Screenplay. So she's got a foot in the door, but Coyote versus Acme is, of course,
is not it, no.
So her approach to screenwriting is very character-centric, which makes me kind of interested to see how she would take on the Looney Tunes property. And it's not fully accessible, but I think it is very artistic, and I think it's something that a lot of critics have found a lot of time for. Critics have really loved May December, way more than I did. But it also has this duality where it references the mid-90s. It sort of has that in its integral form, but it's set in the present. So you get a lot of people who are talking about times that have long gone by, but they share their perspectives, they share their insight. And I think what Birch does really well is that she takes her time to make these characters think about their lives now in relation to then. And it gives them time and perspective, and it also colors their perspective, doesn't it? Because a lot of their characters do have these really strong and unwielding perspectives, whether it's pro-Elizabeth, whether it's anti-Elizabeth, or whether it's pro or anti-Gracie. The narrative style, I actually think, has a specific dramatic flair that I would be interested to hear your thoughts of. You know Moise Kaufman, who wrote The Laramie Project?
Yes, I actually met him He taught at Northwestern. He, for like a very brief period during like the beginning of COVID, they brought in a famous instructor to teach us. And it was Moise Kaufman, yeah.
So Moise Kaufman's Laramie Project is one I'm more familiar with, although I've seen other work that's kind of similar in its very segmented scene-by-scene basis, where it takes a certain perspective on an event or on a character, and they really break it down. And you get 5 minutes of this character and their entire point of view. And I thought that was very similar to May December. I was curious whether you've witnessed Moise Kaufman's work like that, or whether you see that as a comp, or if there are other comps that you typically think of when you think of May December's style.
Well, you know this. When we were both at Columbia, I did an exchange program in England. I moved to England for 8 months and I studied applied theater, which is community-based theater. And one of the sort of main styles was documentary theater, which the Laramie Project draws from, right? Because again, the Laramie Project is based on real events and they're based on real stories and real transcribed interviews of what happened. And in so many ways, this connects because May December is also based on real events, but it feels more like verbatim theater. Again, you're drawing inspiration from the thing that we know to be true, like this big scandal that happened. But at the same time, the writers and the director, the creative team are taking creative liberties. Because at the end of the day, those characters found in May December are just inspirations.
As is Haynes's way of going about it, similar to I'm Not There.
Exactly.
Well, and talking about the real life character, obviously it has Mary Kay Letourneau's DNA all across it, and people obviously know that it is based on her life, but it is also a fictionalized account, and it takes that fictionality and uses it as a shield a little bit. And so the microaggressions and slice of life stuff are, I think, somewhat generous to a person who is pretty harrowing. I mean, it makes her feel like a human person. It does take that time, and it, I think, reminds me of some other Oscar movies in that way. But it takes the time to see where Gracie could ultimately think she was in the right, even though Gracie is, I think, a monster.
Well, that's the thing. If, for example, Gracie was a true protagonist of this film, you know what movie I would think of? I would think of Tar. That's the kind of movie I would think of, where we're trying to understand the monster because they see themselves truly as the victim. And we see Gracie treating herself as the victim, but she herself knows that it's a lie, because in the end of the movie, she proves that she's the one truly in control, and that it's just, she's victimizing herself with intentionality. She does it to keep some semblance of control. It's not inhuman. I think it's also very intentional. She does it because she wants to be happy, but she just does it in monstrous and controlling ways. Again, because she's a person that has such a large family and she's trying to keep them all together. She's trying to keep like the most surface level perfect thing she can. And again, it happens through control. Not dissimilar to Lydia Tarr. You know, she had a perfect life, she had a perfect career, and when things started to change, she started victimizing herself. But two different movies, right? Because one is based on the perspective of the monster being the main character, and the other one being the traditional antagonist. But it's only revealed at the very end, which is a unique sort of dramatic twist that is very, very well done, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I loved Tar. I thought it was near perfect. But the big difference between this and Tar is that I feel like because we are also really getting into, it would be sort of the equivalent of seeing the movie from the eyes of the assistant. And so because of that, we get to see that this character isn't perfect either. And so we're not really getting space to investigate the monster. I think by the end of Tar, I really feel like I understand who Lydia is and what of Lydia's neuroses you can really crack into, because I think the movie does a good job of cracking into it. Whereas I feel like the drama itself is soft pedaling and it doesn't give the large moments time for her to really go there. You know what I mean? So maybe that's my issue, is that like I'm looking for high drama and this is very much a low key kind of film, because like what if the sort of events that happen away from her happened to her? Like if there were things that she had to actually face on, I think this would have been a very different movie.
Yeah, but think about the fact that we're shown a smaller monster. Like that's the reality of the situation, because the movie tries to convince us that the true monster is Elizabeth, the character played by Natalie Portman, right? Because she's so obsessed with mimicking Julianne Moore's Gracie that she is willing to destroy lives to do that. And that's why the emotional core is Charles Melton's character, Joe. You know, he's the emotional core. He's the one that we feel true empathy for because he's literally caught between a rock and a hard place between these two women, because they're both nudging at him and sort of his also like this perfect little world he's made for himself, because he is searching for some kind of escape, whether it be an online relationship or his relationship with his children. And these two women are just pushing against that in subtle but devastating ways.
So we've talked a lot about the character of Gracie, played by Julianne Moore, but now I think have to talk about Charles Melton, who is her other half. And he is interesting because he's not a focal point to a lot of the story. He's definitely a supporting character, but he is a character that I think the big takeaway is him. And the gravity that his character undergoes is so important. In some ways, he is the B-plot character then, if we're talking about structure. So the way that their dynamic shifts throughout the movie sort of gives him a little bit more leverage, gives him a little bit more agency, because at the beginning of the movie, he is more her son than her husband. And her husband, because he's been living in the small town, he's been around, and I've seen this in real life too, is that when you live in a small town, I grew up in a tiny, tiny town, you just don't have a sense of what's outside and you don't have aspirations for what's outside. And I see that a lot in Joe, not necessarily consciously, not necessarily even one of those things where like he couldn't have aspirations, but he's never allowed to. And he speaks about past events almost like he's been hypnotized. And his declarations when he is talking about the events that occurred when he was a middle schooler are sincere. He believes it to his core, but they're also totally empty. And it's so clear that Melton nails the way in which he was never allowed to grow up. And it's a weird, kept emotional thing. I mean, you compare him to like Priscilla in a similar way. She was not really allowed to prosper. And so she has, throughout her life, just had this absolute reverence for her husband. In a similar way, Joe has a lot of reverence for Gracie, despite the fact that Gracie often antagonizes him, makes him feel very small, and keeps his perspective narrow and confined and unambitious. So this is why I think Gracie's treatment of Joe is then inherently infantilizing.
I think abuse comes in various different ways. I truly believe that abuse in the worst kind of way comes in subtleties, in the subtlest but most devastating ways. But I think that another way to look at abuse in particular is robbing choice. One person robbing the ability of another person to choose by manipulation, by gaslighting, by making them feel so small that they feel like they can't make a choice themselves. And I think that's what unites sort of Priscilla and Joe. They are robbed of making choices for themselves. They're being dictated sort of the path to go on, whether it be through duty, as you said with Joe, like the fact that Gracie gave birth to his child. Even though he was like a sixth grader, he felt like a duty to be with her and his child. But again, he was, 14 years old? Less?
Right. Yeah, he had no agency. He had no choice in the situation. Even though Gracie makes it very clear that not only does she believe it, but that she has a network of people around her who support her in that endeavor. And she is unwilling to change. And she knows that Joe doesn't have the tools to change himself. And all that she needs to do is play helpless, and he comes rushing back because that's all he knows. And maybe he even does love her, which makes it even more complicated then.
Absolutely. And I believe he does, because that's all he's known.
So talking about Elizabeth then, you've got the other monster, Monster B, who is also our protagonist. She's the anti-hero, I guess you can say. So she, played by Portman, she does something that is very un-Portman-like in a lot of ways, because Portman, I think of somebody like in Black Swan, where she is in this like really harrowing state, but she's very small. She's got this very delicate energy. And I think that Elizabeth is much more robust and darker in some ways. I mean, obviously, Black Swan has dark themes, but I think the character herself isn't inherently dark. The darkness kind of appears around her and it sort of envelops her throughout the movie. Whereas Elizabeth is the darkness. She loves the darkness. She embraces the darkness. She's a thrill seeker in search of a story.
I'm glad you mentioned Black Swan because I had the same sort of reaction, but I viewed it a bit differently. I saw it as almost like the main character that Natalie Portman played in Black Swan. If that darkness were allowed to fester and grow after that movie, it would turn into Natalie Portman's portrayal of Elizabeth.
Wow, that's really interesting. I mean, clearly she has a focal point.
Well, it's about an artist committing themselves to the darkness in order to do whatever means necessary to succeed.
I mean, Portman was a huge force in making this film, so that doesn't surprise me at all. But her portrayal is pretty muted usually, and it still is in here. I think she's got this sort of like minute and understated thing that makes her so interesting as an actor.
But why? And I can tell you right now. It's because she's shadowing her, right? That's why there is a difference between color palettes. Gracie is a lot more whiter or more colorful, more floral even in her costume design and her dress choices. Natalie Portman is always muted. It's always like gray or black, or it's like a much darker color. And it's because she's literally just serving as a shadow to Gracie.
But throughout the film, she starts to take on certain colors and she starts to take on certain aspects of Gracie because she ultimately wants to play Gracie.
The lipstick in particular.
In particular, yeah. So then ultimately you have Gracie trying to keep normalcy, but then Elizabeth driving in and trying to find the chaos underneath Gracie, where Gracie, not only does she not want her to find it, but she has organized a world in which no one can, even the people who have been searching for decades. She's like, there is no chaos to be found. There is no problem to be found. My life is good. My life is perfect. But yeah, obviously acting styles are going to be very different. Julianne Moore, I think of her really dramatic roles in like The Big Lebowski and in particular Magnolia, where she gives maybe the most boisterous performance of her career. Do you remember her in Magnolia?
Yeah, of course I do.
What was your take on that?
Crazy.
Some people say it's overacting.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of in nature too. I think it's the other side of melodrama in Magnolia.
No, but I love Julianne Moore. I think she's one of the best actresses of our generation. Really. I truly believe that. She is so understated because every time you see a Julianne Moore movie, you're like, okay, it's not Natalie Portman, it's not Jennifer Lawrence, because those are like big names that you think of usually, like real Oscar people. You don't think about Julianne Moore, but Julianne Moore has been nominated 5 times in the Oscars, and she's won. She's won for Still Alice. But because you don't think of her in that way, at least I don't, and it's because she's so like understated. She's so subtle in the way she's acting, but it's so brilliant each and every time because she is truly, truly intentional with her acting. And I think that is perfect for the role of Gracie and Elizabeth, because I think both actresses needed to be so intentional with every single choice they made in portraying these women.
I think from an acting perspective, that's what allows her to sell these big performances too, because of that intentionality. Because if you just go big and you're like, rah, and you just want to be, I mean, I've seen it even this year in the Oscars, where there are people who just want to be loud and have these big emotional moments. And like, really, they're like, I'm acting.
I'm Nick Cage.
But yeah, exactly. And Nick Cage, I think, is also intentional about the projects he picks.
Absolutely.
And I think he uses those projects to go into these very strange places. And he's more of an experimental actor in that way. But I also don't think he claims to be interested in prestige in a traditional sense. I don't know if he's necessarily interested in the projects at their core and sort of being able to really go into the dialogue, unless the dialogue also pairs with what he does well. And so he's done these really prestige-y, interesting projects like Pig, but he's also done a whole decade of projects that to most people are schlock. But I mean, moving back to Moore for a second, she, I think, has a great sense of her gender too in this particular one. Obviously, in The Big Lebowski, she plays this like feminist character from the 90s, so it's very much feminist in that 90s sense of femininity. But you also have in this movie her being much more restrained in some ways. She wants to restrain herself, but because it's Julianne Moore, there is sort of the broadness that starts to peek through. And so having that almost like, you know, she's leveling her herself out and she's attuning to the ability and then she's bringing it back down. And that's the performance. So Elizabeth obviously is a protagonist, but she's also not the central figure, which is, I think, the interesting thing about this movie. So the way that this is a movie, you can sort of say that it might be a thriller. I wanted to pose that as a genre because it could be just a drama, right? We could just say drama and then leave it be. But there's something underneath it too. Broy Deschanel said melodrama. I think melodrama is a little imperfect because it relies pretty heavily on a certain type of melodrama. She goes deeply into Douglas Sirk and his method of melodrama. And I think while this story is a little Sirkian, it also doesn't feel nearly the same as the melodramas of the 20th century. I think of Ali Fear Eats the Soul as a German melodrama that's really beautiful, but it's also it has that subtlety, but it's also like very simple in its portrayal of this story in a way that May December isn't. May December has a little bit of something extra. It has a little bit of something more, and it's hard to say what, but it's very clearly self-referential. And I wanted to ask you about that self-referentiality, whether you noticed it, whether it interfered with your experience at all, whether it colored your experience at all.
It lampoons it a little bit, yeah, because the character of Elizabeth, because she is so hyper-focused on making her portrayal of Gracie real, she loves using that term, real. I want to make it more real. I need to make it more real. And her obsession with it almost becomes comedic in a way, right? Because she is chasing something so aggressively that she is willing to destroy other people just to get it, which, again, feels like nonsense. It feels nonsensical. But I think the true lampooning of it, quote unquote, happens at the very, very end, that scene where they're finally shooting the movie. And because she's wanted it to be so real for so long, we're imagining an Oscar-worthy sort of set and a real, like, visceral and dramatic experience in that last scene when they're shooting this film. But instead, it just looks like schlock. She's wearing a bad wig. She's wearing, very cheap nightgown, and they're playing around with what looks like a rubber snake. It's ridiculous. And even when the director is trying to move on, he's trying to move on to the next scene, she's like, no, one more time. We're getting close to it being real. I feel like that completes the circle of it being like, especially with her character, it feels like a lampooning parody critique over this kind of dramatization. Because I think Todd Haynes in particular is looking at himself and he's like, I took a real story and I made art out of it. What are the repercussions of that? I've affected people with this. Sure, I've taken the characters that are inspired by real people and have made them my own, but I still took that inspiration. What does that say about me? It's almost self-referential in that way.
I think that self-referentiality holds me back a little bit too, though. It's got a lot of this character that we've seen more and more in movies where we're all indoctrinated with the internet, and post-internet movies feel very different. And I think there are movies that I think nail it. I think there's some stuff that's really cool. On my end of year for 2022, I talked about We're All Going to the World's Fair, which has that internet inside it. It has this like Gen Z sensibility, and I love that. I have a card right here for a movie called How to Blow Up a Pipeline, which has that similar Gen Z sensibility. This does not really have a Gen Z sensibility, and I think its self-referentiality is a hindrance to me a little bit. But you mentioned stuff like comedy and lampoon, so I'm curious whether you have a similar take as the Golden Globes, because the Globes actually nominated this as a comedy. Do you think this movie is a comedy?
I think this movie is as much a comedy as Brecht's work. Bertolt Brecht.
And who is Bertolt Brecht?
He's a very famous German playwright who very much hated the idea of realism, which was a theatrical style that we still use today. Basically, it creates a story that feels real, on stage, but because it feels so real, there's an illusion that emanates from it because we empathize with the situation on stage. That's where realism sort of comes from, that we see ourselves on what's happening on stage. Brecht hated that. He was like, no, we shouldn't talk about issues, like actual issues, in a subtle way in order to manipulate the audience. We should just tell them in the forefront what we're trying to do. So his art continuously broke the illusion. The audience constantly knew they were watching a play. Never had they had a moment where they were like, wow, I really feel like I'm in this cabin in France. No. He was like, we are in a terrible basement theater here in Frankfurt.
I've heard scholars and our professors agree, because we've studied Brecht both in school. The interesting thing about Brecht is that was his sensibility and that was his goal and philosophy. I think his philosophy on theater is really wonderful. I think also Brecht's plays are really cool, but sometimes Brecht is bad at Brechting, because you have these stories that are really intricately made and he's really honestly good with character. And because of that, we end up falling at least a little bit in love with the characters in spite of the creator's intentions, which is kind of the funny thing. I mean, death of the author and all that. But like Brecht ultimately sometimes is less Brecht than May December, wherein, and to be clear, so when you have a play, you have obviously 3 walls, and there's that area where it's called proscenium, where the stage stops and the audience starts. And they call that the 4th wall, obviously, because we're looking out. And we talk about that in movies too. Breaking the 4th wall would be something like in the show House of Cards, when the main character looks directly at the camera and starts speaking to us as an audience.
Or
Deadpool, where he loves to break the 4th wall and constantly reference the fact that he's in a Marvel movie. So you get that aspect in May December too, but obviously they're not just looking at the camera and speaking about it, but they're being very intentional about the fact that this is a story about actors. So we're constantly thinking about actors and drama, and the themes of the story work in such a way that it is a meta commentary on this subject while they are telling the subject. That is where I think it stops short for me a little bit. Maybe just because my expectation was that I could get a really in-depth story about this particular subject. And I have been waiting for something that doesn't, in fact, fall in love with its character, something that really takes a biting stance to critique pedophiles, especially because you have something like Priscilla, where my main critique is that I feel like it doesn't really go far enough, because Priscilla doesn't believe Elvis is a villain. Priscilla also doesn't portray Elvis as a villain, and the movie never really goes there. Similar to Baz Luhrmann's, doesn't really ever go there. And then there's still stuff like in this month alone, we have a Martin Freeman movie called Miller's Girl, which is explicitly about a teacher and a student relationship. It was in theaters in January, and it was awful, and it made me feel really pessimistic about movies. And so I think that May December has a means to go someplace, and I wish it went there. I wish I had something that fulfilled that need to really exemplify what does it mean to be a pedophile in 2024? Because the fact of the matter is, there is still a lot of conversations about it, but I don't think we actually have a sense. People on the right think it's one thing, people on the left think it's another thing, and it just isn't really a sense of what does it look like in practice.
You look at a movie, especially a movie in 2024. The movie is about the message, not about the dramatization or the story, right? That's what I feel like those Oscar movies have become. It's about the message. And just like Brecht, it was ultimately about the message he was saying. It wasn't about the characters. Even though you wanted to fall in love with the characters, and many of the times you do, because he's such a wonderful writer. The same thing with Todd Haynes' work here in May December. There's a lot to love about these characters. But at the end of the day, the message supersedes them. It's about sort of what the story is trying to tell, what the director is trying to tell, as opposed to what these true life characters are trying to say, right? Because we leave them in a weird spot. All 3 of them, we leave them in a weird spot. Gracie, Joe, and Elizabeth. And because we become invested in their story, it creates almost an uncanny valley feeling with the ending, right? Because again, it falls into the idea of it truly being about the message. It needs to be more real. But it's not, because it's not real. It's not real life. It's drawing from inspiration of something that was real, but because it is fiction and because it's referencing that, it can never be real.
I mean, the Brechtian tone suggests that in fact drama ought not be anyway. So it follows that perfectly. But of course, we do see reality and we do see aspects and we do pursue it. And I think it's just not the intention of the team, whether it be Haynes, whether it be Sammy Birch. It's just not their intention to go there either. They don't want to investigate the mind. I think Tar is, while not real in any means, I think it portrays a closer version of reality. And I think that is to me the thing that I'm missing is I want that satiation. To me, it was sort of like if you've ever had a drink where it's like really, really, really sour, sometimes you drink it and then you end up finishing the glass and you go, well, now I'm just more thirsty. That was my experience watching May December, where I felt like I was intaking the story that when I left, it made me more thirsty. Now that said, that was the intention of Brecht in the first place. So it's, of course, the full probably means of, and that's why I have to be like, this is a good film, because while it might not be to my taste, it's also effective at doing the thing that it set out to do, which is make the audience go out and seek more.
Yeah, because you're still thinking about it, right? That was Brecht's issue with realism. He felt like it was cheap entertainment, that people like thought about it in the moment, but after they left the theater, after like a week had passed, they never thought about it again. And he was like, no, I want to make art that's affecting, art that forces change. And the fact that we're talking about May, December on our podcast,
yeah, it's proof. But there are some other things in the Oscar world that I think are similar, but are also, I think, not things I think are as worth pursuing. Two of which are All of Us Strangers. They're movies that I found a little underwhelming. All of Us Strangers, which is a dynamic that also stays pretty soft and pretty general and very like drama focused, very prestige. Not a whole lot happens in it. And it also, I think, left me wanting a little bit more. But it is also about familiar relationships, and it's about the drama and specifically the trauma that is left behind. And I think that's something that is very, very present in the world of the Oscars right now. I mean, we saw it with Everything Everywhere All at Once. And another thing that I wanted to bring up is in terms of style, right? So that's substance. In terms of style, there's this movie out right now called Zone of Interest. It has slowly been released throughout theaters. It's a story about Nazis. I can't say that I adored it. I thought it was really droll. I mean, to me, if May December is like a 4 on the interesting scale, and like, I don't know, Avengers Infinity War or something, like, I don't know, Crank High Voltage is like a 10, like something that is just so focused on being interesting that it might sacrifice plot in the interest of being interesting, I would say that like Zone of Interest is like a 1.5. It is really slow. It takes its time. It's very similar to Glazer's film Under the Skin in that way, because Under the Skin is also a slower movie. It's also a movie I didn't totally get or care for, but it's also a movie that is interested in portraying the monster. And that is something that we've seen more and more post-Trump. And so I wanted to talk about this piece of media. I don't know if this is sort of too broad, but as a means of post-Trump entertainment. This and Zone of Interest are both movies and Tar about a monster, about what they're doing, and we get to see their entire life. In Zone of Interest, it's their entire domicile, and we get the mind of a Nazi played full in this full-length feature. Obviously, that has to do with the fact that we are currently at an election cycle where it may be possible that Donald Trump, who is currently also being pursued legally, could become president again. That can't be an accident. So what do you think the duty is then of art like this in the world of 2024?
I mean, it's an interesting dynamic at the end of the day, right? Because it combines two interesting things that are happening. One, that it feels like we're going in a very pessimistic sort of direction. There's less heroic and more anti-hero or villainous sort of main characters, or stories that focus on the monster, as we've talked about. And I think it's about also understanding the monster, because that's dramatically interesting. And in many ways, I can relate. My favorite movie of all time is Amadeus, which tries to discern of how person can become a monster and investigate that in a dramatic effect. But in the other way, I think we're trying to show the monster and we're trying to look at these things in a deeper level, like with Tar being a huge example, because we're trying to hold people more accountable with their actions. I think that's ultimately what we're trying to say as artists right now, because it's not just Trump, it's also the Me Too movement, right? And a bunch of other factors attaching to that. I think in the most hopeful way, the art is trying to teach us to be gentler, to be more accountable, to not turn into those monsters. I just think that we're not doing it in the best way, because it takes a lot of introspection to sort of get that kind of message. And again, this is my interpretation. My interpretation is not a factual one. It's a subjective one. But, we've been going through a lot as a society around the world. There have been wars. There's been COVID. There's been crazy political issues that affected the entire world. And a lot of very high volume sort of misconduct towards people and disenfranchisement. I think ultimately, with these films showing that darkness so much, to be like, this is the worst human human beings can get. It's almost like a warning sign. But I don't think that's the best way to do it. I truly don't. Even though I find that art more interesting because I love dark material, I do. I'm drawn to it. I think if we're truly trying to change and trying to be better as a society, we need to be kinder again. We actually need to show gentleness. We need to show kindness. And a movie like May December shows no kindness. Realistically, Charles Melton Joe is a very kind human being, but he's being punished for his kindness over and over and over again. And I don't know. I don't think that's the message we should be sending out.
That's very interesting. I agree 100%. I have no notes. I think that my main critique in both of these is that it could be a little bit more interested in that movement of what's next. And I think Zone of Interest is the epitome of staying in the darkness and not going towards the light. Because if you look at other stuff, like movies like Barbie, where it's not as interested in the politics, it has politics, but it's not that interested in it. What it's interested in is characters who are actually interested in doing better. And the same thing with Oppenheimer, funnily enough, is he's a character who is constantly interested in improving life, improving the world. And even though Oppenheimer makes mistakes, and we'll see in a few weeks whether Oppenheimer wins Best Picture, I expect it might, but it's moving in a direction where we have these big blockbuster movies where ultimately the protagonists are really optimistic and really kind. And I think that is a hunger in the cinema right now. And it's become less and less easy to get away within the world, and here's the title of the show, Zeitgeist. It's less easy to make apolitical art because people are starting to see the politics in art, even when maybe the artists aren't intending it to be there. So the days of making something that's 4-quadrant that can hit both the right and the left is becoming a more and more and more narrow margin. Even imagine Avatar, which is obviously a movie about ecology and the movie about being like green energy and not taking advantage of a planet. That movie is 4-quadrant, but it's still fairly political in its approach. It's just very soft in its politics. And that is how you make 4 quadrants now. Barbie is another example. And so even though this kind of story isn't going to be across the globe, something that everyone's going to view, although Netflix does, in fact, I think, have it on most streaming services. Were you able to watch it across the globe?
Yeah.
So it very clearly could be viewed in a lot of places. Who knows if it is being viewed in a lot of places? So that said, I think it's a really interesting year for the Academy Awards. I've seen a lot of really cool stuff in my pursuit, but I think that moving forward, I want to see a little bit more of that optimism. I agree. And that said, we've got another very exciting year of Zeitgeist. We talked about Deadpool, right? Deadpool 3 is coming this year. That's going to be very exciting. We've got a lot of other really cool blockbusters coming up as well that we're really excited to talk about. But we're actually going a little bit small screen next couple of weeks. We've got another show coming, and it is going to be, do you want to tell them or should I?
You should.
It's going to be Scavenger's Reign and Blue-Eyed Samurai. Blue-Eyed Samurai is going to be viewed on Netflix, and Scavenger's Reign is on HBO Max. You can watch both of these shows in their completion now and get ready for us to talk about it if you like. So on that note, I have been Jordan Conrad.
And I'm Niv Boz.
And we are closing off on Zeitgeist. We will see you guys in a few weeks. Take care of yourselves. Stay curious. Stay interested in the movies and TV and books if you like to, or music, everything. Culture is important. Culture is so important in a world where we have to be intentional about the culture we're consuming and being aware of what's going on politically too, because all of it is all connected. So keep an eye out, guys. We'll see you next time.
And be kind.